"You're not supposed to be here." That's what her eyes said before her lips even moved. My younger sister, Sienna, stood in a halo of chandeliers and champagne flutes, grinning like she owned the entire city of Charleston. Sequins shimmered on her dress. Her friends clung to her every word. It was her engagement party, her night, her story. And I was just the older sister, the quiet one, the judge. My name is Natalie Moore. I'm 39. I've sent murderers, embezzlers, and liars to prison with nothing but my voice. But none of that seemed to matter in the one courtroom that never gave me a trial, my own family. I walked in alone, black dress, no jewelry, just enough to be forgotten, but tailored enough to remind them I chose this. As I made my way toward the bar, she turned. That smile, all silk and venom, greeted me like an old wound. She leaned into her friends, whispered. They laughed, glanced over, dismissive, curious, pitying. I've seen juries deliver death sentences with kinder eyes. But what she didn't know is that I hadn't come to blend in. I came because I was done being invisible. And when the time came, I wouldn't need to raise my voice. Just one sentence would be enough to silence them all. Have you ever been in a room full of family and still felt like a stranger? Tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to earn respect the hard way, you're not alone. I used to think that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, and didn't cause problems, I'd eventually be seen. Turns out, some people only notice you when you stop playing by the rules they wrote for you. Growing up, Sienna was the light. Everyone said it. She's so bubbly. She's a natural performer. She just walks into a room and brings it to life. Meanwhile, I was the shadow, the kid with ink-stained fingers, the one who stayed behind in the classroom after the bell, organizing papers for the teacher because it felt safer than the cafeteria. I wasn't shy. I was calculating. I was watching, but they called it quiet. My parents never meant harm, I think. They just didn't know what to do with a daughter who preferred case studies over dance recitals, who asked questions that made dinner awkward, who refused to smile just to make the room more comfortable. Sienna could fail a math test and still get an ice cream cone on the way home. I once brought home a 98 in chemistry and was asked where the missing 2 points went. It wasn't jealousy. It was erasure. At 13. She borrowed my favorite sweater and spilled soda all over it. When I asked her to at least apologize, she laughed and called me obsessive. At 15, I won a regional debate competition. My dad missed it because Sienna had a last-minute cheer tryout. At 17, I got early admission into Yale. My mom's first comment was, "That's pretty far from home, isn't it?" I remember once hearing her tell a neighbor, "Natalie's just intense. Sienna, on the other hand, knows how to enjoy life." They said it like that was a flaw. In our house, charm beat character. Volume beat substance. And if you weren't smiling, you were the problem. By the time we hit our 20s, the labels were set in stone. Sienna was the pretty one, the social one, the one who dated boys with guitars and wore mismatched earrings like a fashion statement. I was the serious one, the rule follower, the girl who always knew where the emergency exits were in a room, just in case. She majored in communications and dropped out twice. I double majored in political science and legal studies, graduated summa cum laude, and never once got a congratulations card. And the thing is, I didn't resent her. Not really. I resented how small I had to make myself just to keep the peace. There was a Thanksgiving I'll never forget. I was 26. I'd just passed the bar. Everyone was talking about Sienna's new boyfriend, an actor from Atlanta who'd done 2 commercials for a regional car dealership. He wasn't even at dinner. But somehow, he took up more space at that table than I did. When I tried to share my news, how I'd landed my first job at the district attorney's office, my mom smiled and said, "That's nice, honey. But try not to talk shop at the table. It makes people uncomfortable." Sienna winked across her wine glass. I didn't say another word that night. Years passed like that. Weddings, birthdays, family gatherings where I was always the afterthought. The plus one to my own bloodline. When people asked what I did for a living, Sienna would jump in before I could answer. She works in law. You know, like court stuff. That was all they got. That was all she gave. And I let her. Because for a long time, I believed that being misunderstood was better than being confrontational. That if I just kept my head down, they'd see me eventually. But the thing about being invisible is that after a while, you start to forget what you look like, too. That's why I almost didn't go to the party. The invitation arrived in a gold-trimmed envelope, scented with something floral and fake. Inside, it read, "Join us to celebrate the engagement of Sienna Moore and Jonathan Reed." There was no mention of me. No plus one. No note. Just a text later that week. "Hey sis, no pressure if you're busy. It'll be kind of formal though. Jonathan's parents are super image conscious, so maybe don't wear anything too serious, lol. Hugs and kisses. Anything too serious." That line stayed with me for days. She still thought of me as that girl in secondhand blazers, clinging to rules, to silence, to a version of life that made her uncomfortable. She had no idea how serious I'd become. But soon, she would. The last time Sienna asked me what I did, I told her I was just keeping busy. She nodded, half listening, already mid-scroll through her phone. Probably texting a man whose last name she wouldn't remember next week. That's how it always was. Sienna didn't really ask questions. She built narratives, short, sweet, manageable, the kind you could toss out at brunch without risking a follow-up. To her, my life was a blur of legal mumbo-jumbo. Maybe a clerk, maybe admin. She never cared enough to get it right. And for a while, I let her think whatever she wanted. Let them all think that. Because if they didn't ask, I didn't have to explain. But outside my family bubble, in rooms that smelled like dry paper and sweat under fluorescent lights, I was someone. I was seen. I clerked for a federal judge in D.C. straight out of law school. My name was on memos that shaped real policy. I prosecuted white-collar criminals who hid fortunes behind shell companies and smiled like saints. I didn't just work in law. I lived it. I'd spent nights poring over evidence that could make or break lives. I'd prepped witnesses at 3 a.m., skipped holidays to meet deadlines, and been called Your Honor by men in $5,000 suits who couldn't look me in the eye. At 38. I was appointed as a judge for the 14th District of South Carolina, the youngest ever at the time. My photo was in the Charleston Gazette, standing on the courthouse steps, robes in hand. Expression unreadable. I mailed a copy to my parents. No call, no message, not even a nice photo, kid. I didn't cry. Not anymore. Because somewhere along the line, I'd stopped needing applause to know I was worthy. Distance, I'd learned, wasn't the same as peace. And silence, real silence, wasn't always a punishment. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes it's power. So when I got that ridiculous invitation from Sienna, part of me laughed. The irony of it. She wanted me to come, but not be too serious. She wanted the family name, but not the family weight. I thought about not going. I had a case backlog. Court was in session the next day, but something kept tugging at me. Not out of spite, not revenge, but clarity. Because after all the years of being misrepresented, maybe I was finally ready to show up, not to make a scene, but to make an impression. So I booked the flight, rented my own car, declined the hotel block she'd reserved for guests she actually knew. And I chose my dress with precision. Not flashy, not casual. Black, sleek, understated. The kind of dress that says, I am not here for your approval. And when I arrived at the venue, a glassy hilltop estate that reeked of old money cosplay, I gave my name to the valet and walked in without hesitation. No plus one, no smile, just presence. Inside, it was just as I expected. People sipping rose like it was holy water. Conversations about destination weddings and investment portfolios that smelled of borrowed confidence. Jonathan's parents were exactly who I imagined. Pristine posture, practiced smiles, unbothered money. Sienna was in her element. She moved like a current, all sparkle and practiced affection. Every word out of her mouth was wrapped in charm. Every laugh half a beat too loud. Every compliment felt rehearsed. I stayed back near the far end of the room, watching. I could have blended in perfectly. Just another neutral figure in black, sipping champagne. Pretending not to listen. But Sienna spotted me. Of course she did. Her smile twitched just slightly before she approached. "Well, look who made it," she said, tilting her head the way she always did when preparing a jab masked as kindness. "Didn't think you'd actually show." "I had the time," I replied, sipping calmly. She eyed my outfit. "Black?" "For an engagement party. It keeps things grounded," I said smoothly. She fake laughed. Classic Natalie. Always so serious. There it was again. That word. Serious. As if it were a disease. As if caring deeply meant something was wrong with you. She leaned in. "Just try not to make things awkward, okay? Jonathan's family is very," she gestured vaguely, image aware. "Then maybe they'll get some real answers," I said. Her smile froze. Only for a second. Then she laughed again and turned away, back into the world where she was adored. I stood alone. Not uncomfortable, not uncertain. Just aware. They still didn't know who I was. And that was fine. Because the verdict wasn't in yet. But it would be. Soon enough. Dinner was served in waves. Like a parade of delicate, overpriced metaphors. Microgreens no one could identify. Smoked duck with fig compote. Sea bass that smelled like ego and lemon foam. I sat at the far end of the long reception hall, half hidden by a centerpiece made of white orchids and ego. I wasn't there for the food. I wasn't there for the company. I was there to be reminded, one last time, of what it felt like to be erased. At some point, Sienna floated past with Jonathan on her arm. He gave me a polite nod, the kind you give to a librarian or someone who bags your groceries. Kind, impersonal, brief. "Clarice's older sister, right?" he asked. "Natalie," I corrected, evenly. He smiled. "Sienna said you work in government stuff? Admin, maybe?" I didn't answer. Just sipped my water. Let the silence settle like a judge entering the courtroom. Then, with practiced calm, I said something like that. He nodded, content with his own vague understanding, and turned back to Sienna, who looked smug, like she'd just gotten away with something. I let them go. I always let them go. Until I didn't. The speeches started just after dessert. Sienna stood at the center of the room, glass of champagne in hand, glowing under the chandelier light like it was made just for her. "I just want to say thank you," she began, her voice sweet and theatrical. "To everyone who made tonight so special." Scattered applause. A few camera flashes. Jonathan smiled beside her like he'd won a trophy. "I know I seem put together now," she continued, tilting her head, "but I wasn't always this way. Growing up, I was wild. And my sister," she gestured toward me without turning, "was the opposite. Laughter. Anticipation. She once filed a written complaint when I borrowed her sweater. I was 13. She was 16. Can you believe that? More laughter. I didn't move. She's always been that way. Judgy. Intense. Rigid. But hey, I'm just glad she showed up tonight. She's not big on family events, or smiling." She winked at me. The room chuckled. Jonathan leaned in with a grin and added, "But really, we're glad you came. I mean, from what Sienna says. You work in, what was it again? County records." He looked at me with that same benign smile, the kind people wear when they think they're including you. And there it was. The joke. Not cruel. Just small. an erasure masquerading as civility, a dismissal dressed as humor. I placed my fork down carefully, wiped the corner of my mouth with a napkin, and looked up, straight at Jonathan. "I'm sorry," I said evenly. "Where did you hear that?" He blinked. "Sienna just mentioned something. Office work. Local stuff." I nodded slowly. Let the moment stretch like a taut string. Then I smiled. "No, that's not correct." Sienna laughed nervously. "Oh, come on, Nat. Don't be so dramatic. We're just playing." I turned back to Jonathan. My voice didn't rise. My tone didn't shift. "I don't work in county records. I'm a judge." Silence. Not the polite kind. Not the social kind. The kind of silence that pulls oxygen from the room. From a nearby table, a woman gasped. A man lowered his phone and blinked. A voice broke the quiet, almost breathless. "Wait, Judge Moore." Now eyes turned. Mouths hung open. Fingers hovered over phones, already Googling. A name came up. A trial. An article in the Washington Post. Another whisper. She handled the Fairfax corruption case. And then Jonathan looked at me, really looked, as if for the first time. The portrait on the wall was actually a mirror. "You're a judge." I nodded. "Superior Court, 14th District." He dropped his hand from Sienna's waist. Sienna opened her mouth. But no words came out. Only a strangled sound, halfway between a laugh and a question. I didn't know you were still doing that," she stammered. "I thought you. I mean, you never said." "Because you never asked," I said quietly. I stood, not abruptly, just purposefully. Folded my napkin. Set it gently on my plate. There was no need to raise my voice. The room had already heard everything it needed to. No anger. No theatrics. Just truth. And truth, when delivered without apology, is louder than any microphone. I turned and walked past them all. Sienna, Jonathan, my parents, who now looked like spectators in a courtroom they never thought they'd be called into. No one moved. No one stopped me. Not a single person tried to explain themselves. They didn't need to. I already had the verdict. I didn't look back when I walked out of that room. Not once. Not even when I heard my name, softly, broken, floating behind me like an afterthought. The air outside hit different. Cooler. Lighter. Like a courtroom after a long trial. When the gavel's been struck, and justice, whatever form it takes, has finally landed. The gravel crunched under my heels as I made my way to the car. Each step felt heavier than it should have, but also lighter than it ever had. I slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and just sat there for a moment, breathing. No music, no phone, just silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence I'd grown up with, the sharp, judging kind that hung over family dinners and turned every compliment into a comparison. No, this was silence as peace, as truth. And then the buzz came. Once. Then again. My phone lit up in the passenger seat, screen glowing with names I hadn't seen in months. Mom, missed call. Sienna, 2 messages. I let it ring, and when it stopped, I picked up the phone, not to reply, but to read. You should have told me. Why would you embarrass me like that? I almost laughed, because of course, it wasn't about what I'd said. It was about what I'd revealed, what I'd unmasked. They weren't ashamed of forgetting who I was. They were ashamed I reminded them that I disrupted the neat little narrative where I stayed small and they stayed comfortable. And in that moment, I realized something. They hadn't failed to see me because I was invisible. They failed because they never looked. I drove through Charleston that night like I used to as a student, streets I once wandered in search of identity, validation, a place to belong. Now, I passed them with the stillness of someone who had built their own place, brick by quiet brick. I remembered a night in my 20s, sitting in the back of a bus after a brutal deposition. No one called. No one asked if I was okay. And I told myself then, Maybe this is just the cost of being serious, of being sharp, of not being soft enough for the world to hold. But they were wrong. Being serious didn't make me cold. It made me steady. Being sharp didn't make me cruel. It made me precise. And being invisible didn't make me weak. It made me aware. Somewhere between the third red light and the gas station I used to stop at in college, my mother called again. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't need to hear her ask questions she'd never dared to before. Didn't need to hear her try to rewrite a story she never paid attention to in the first place. Because I had finally learned. I wasn't obligated to explain myself just because they were suddenly listening. The burden of being seen should never fall on the one who's been ignored. Later that night, I checked into my hotel, not the one Sienna had reserved, but a quiet little place with no pretension and a view of the marshlands. I kicked off my heels, washed the makeup off my face, and stood in front of the mirror, not posing, just being. I didn't see the serious sister or the difficult one. I saw a woman who had earned every inch of her life, every scar, every quiet victory, every headline they never read. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride, not power, just enough. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened Sienna's messages one more time. You should have told me. Why would you do that in front of everyone? I typed, then deleted. Typed again. Then finally wrote. I didn't say anything untrue. You just didn't expect me to speak. I didn't hit send. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't owe clarity to people who never sought it. Instead, I turned off the phone, set it on the nightstand, and let the quiet stretch around me like armor. They might spend the rest of their lives trying to shrink me back into the version that made sense to them. But I was done folding myself to fit. I flew home the next morning. No dramatic sunrise. No movie scene farewell. Just the low hum of jet engines, a black coffee, and the steady rhythm of truth settling in. It wasn't like anything had changed, but somehow everything had. When I landed, I didn't turn my phone back on right away. I wasn't ready to read whatever new explanations, accusations, or apologies might have followed. Let them sit. Let them stew in the silence they gave me for years. I headed straight to the courthouse. Monday morning. Security guards nodded at me like usual. The clerk brought me a docket. My assistant handed me a folder and said, "Morning, Judge Moore," like nothing had happened. And yet, beneath the surface, I could feel it. A shift, a weight had been lifted, not from my shoulders, but from the air around me. I was no longer carrying their version of me. I had set it down. The first hearing was routine. Property dispute. 2 neighbors fighting over a fence, a tree, and an inch of land no one would ever use. But I listened. Carefully. Completely. Because that's what I do. That's what I've always done, even when no one returned the favor. After I ruled, the plaintiff, an elderly woman in a pale green cardigan, stood awkwardly by the bench. I just wanted to say thank you, she said. You listen better than most. I nodded. It's my job. She shook her head. No, it's more than that. You see people, even the small ones. I froze. Not visibly, but inside, that sentence hit like a verdict. Later that day, I walked past the front desk and caught a younger attorney glancing up from her tablet. She looked maybe 26, fresh out of law school, nerves tucked into every corner of her oversized blazer. Judge Moore, she asked. I turned. I saw the clip from the party. My brows lifted. She flushed. Someone posted it online. Just a few seconds. You standing there. The part where you said, "You never asked." That line, it hit. I didn't know what to say. She continued. My sister's the Sienna in my family. Always the star. And I'm just the shadow. Or was. We locked eyes for a moment. The courtroom buzzed around us, elevators dinging, papers rustling, but something in that quiet lingered longer. You're not a shadow, I said softly. She smiled. Not wide, not confident, but real. "Neither are you," she whispered. Then she walked away. That night, I finally checked my messages. 3 from Sienna, 2 from Mom, even 1 from Jonathan. "I didn't realize how much I didn't know about you. That wasn't fair, and I get that now. You didn't deserve that." They weren't apologies. Not really. They were reactions. Responses to exposure. To truth spilled in public, no longer easy to ignore. But I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't holding out for validation. And maybe that's why, for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to explain anything. The weight they'd put on me, it belonged to them now. I went to bed early. No wine, no overthinking, no replaying the scene in my mind for the 100th time. I didn't need to, because this time, the moment had been enough. No one defended me. No one clapped. No one chased after me with tears or regrets. And still, the silence that followed wasn't lonely. It was clean. Like standing in a house you finally get to decorate for yourself after years of renting space in someone else's story. I thought of Sienna then. What she must have felt as the laughter died down. The eyes turned and the Googling began. Did she feel shame? Resentment? Shock? Or just the unfamiliar sensation of not being the one in control? Whatever it was, I hoped quietly, privately, that she finally saw me. Not the version of me she invented for her stories. Not the caricature. Not the sister who always wore black and ruined the mood. Me. The one who had been there all along. I never wanted to be the center of attention. Not once. Even as a child, when teachers asked for volunteers or birthday candles were lit in my honor, I'd shrink back just enough to avoid the heat. I didn't need people looking at me. I needed them to see me. There's a difference. The spotlight burns. The truth illuminates. And all my life, I'd been taught to believe the only way to earn love was to be agreeable, polite, small, to not correct anyone, to not make things awkward, to be the backdrop to someone else's scene. But I know better now. I was never too serious. They were just too comfortable in a world that asked nothing of them, not even curiosity. I still haven't replied to Sienna's messages. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. But if I do, it won't be to make her feel better. It will be to make myself clear. I'm not angry. I just finally stopped playing the part you wrote for me. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't need to scream. It doesn't beg. It simply exists and waits for the rest of the world to catch up. I think she's starting to. Jonathan sent a second message a few days later. If I'd known who you were, I never would have said that. I didn't reply to him either, because that was the point. He did know who I was. He just didn't think it mattered. A week later, I was walking into my chambers when I spotted an envelope on my desk. No return address. Inside, a photo. Me at the engagement party. Not posed. Not even centered. Just me, standing alone in the corner, half in the shadow of the floral arch, half in the light of the chandelier. On the back, in careful cursive, someone had written, "You didn't need a spotlight. You made the room tilt anyway." There was no name, no signature, just silence. And that, somehow, felt perfect. In the weeks that followed, I started to notice something. Not from my family. They were still trying to figure out what this meant for them. But from others. A junior clerk began asking me how I handled being overlooked early in my career. A legal intern sent me an anonymous thank you note, saying her mother had cried watching the video clip online. One of the court guards, a man who usually only nodded, stopped me in the hall and said, "My daughter's in med school. Always felt like she wasn't the fun one. I told her about you." The story had grown legs not because I chased attention, but because people recognized themselves in the silence I broke. There's power in quiet. It's not the absence of noise. It's the presence of clarity. And I've learned that sometimes the most dignified thing you can do is to walk out of the room without flinching and let the truth echo in your place. Because the people who never looked, they'll start noticing the outline of what they ignored. And the ones who felt small their whole lives, they'll start to stand a little straighter. Not out of revenge, but out of recognition. I'm still Natalie Moore. Still serious. Still quiet. Still the one who folds her napkin before she leaves the table. But now, I no longer wait for the spotlight to warm me, because I've learned. I was never cold. They just never bothered to come close enough to feel the fire. If you've ever been called too much or not enough, if you've ever swallowed your accomplishments just to keep a dinner table calm, if you've ever been introduced as a footnote in your own story, let this be a reminder. You don't need anyone's permission to be whole. You don't owe silence to people who never asked who you were. And you don't have to shrink so others feel tall. Show up as you are. Speak when it counts. And remember, sometimes the most powerful sentence you'll ever say is simply, "That's not correct."